John Bellairs is best known for his gothic mystery books written for children and young adults, such as The House with a Clock in Its Walls and The Curse of the Blue Figurine. But did you know that before that, he wrote a fantasy novel inspired by The Lord of the Rings that Lynn Carter described as one of the three best fantasy novels written since The Lord of the Rings? That book is The Face in the Frost, and I think it is one of the better pieces of speculative fiction you can find on Appendix N, the collection of books Gary Gygax listed as major influences on the creation of D&D. What is speculative fiction, Court? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say about it. Speculative fiction is a category of fiction that, in its broadest sense, encompasses the genres that depart from reality, such as in the context of supernatural, futuristic, and other imaginative realms. This umbrella category includes, but is not limited to, science fiction, fantasy, horror, superhero fiction, alternate history, utopian and dystopian fiction, and supernatural fiction, as well as combinations thereof, for example, science fantasy. The term has been used with a variety of meanings for works of literature. I had to move my mic down a little. It looked like it was stealing all the real estate on the screen. I use speculative fiction as a catch-all for books that don't fit into the genre molds that most modern books are jammed into. I love when my fantasy gets a splash of horror or sci-fi. Some people whine about genre mixing, but then go on to say they love Star Wars, which is just druids wielding energy swords, but what do I know? I guess this is a good time to show off the copy I own. It's a, trade-ish paperback. It's from Open Road. I think they print a lot of stuff like this. And it's fine. It's not the highest quality, but I don't think it's going to fall apart on me in the next, 20 years. Well, I got this out. Let's read the back. The Face in the Frost is a fantasy classic, defying categorization with its richly imaginative story of two separate kingdoms of wizards, stymied by a power that is beyond their control. A tall, skinny misfit of a wizard named Prospero lives in the southern kingdom, a patchwork of feuding duchies and small manors, all loosely loyal to one figurehead king. Both Prospero and an improbable adventurer named Roger Bacon look in mirrors to see different times and places, which greatly affect their personalities and mannerisms, and leads them into a myriad of situations that are sometimes frightening and often hilarious. That description is okay. It doesn't really give away any of the plot. It also kind of leads you to think the book is different than what it actually is. I'm not going to dig too much into that. I would normally give a little more details for what happens in the book, but the story starts off at such a fast pace that describing any of it takes away from the experience of reading it for yourself. I'm not going to list the pros and cons for this review because there aren't really any cons bad enough that I need to single them out. The main reason I call it speculative fiction is because Bellairs does such a good job of mixing fantasy and horror that you could silo The Face in the Frost in the horror or fantasy genre, and it would make sense. The mirrors described on the back of the book give it a multiverse vibe that really added to my overall enjoyment of the book. Bellairs is the master of writing nightmares and dreams you just can't wake up from, and there are plenty in this book. Parts of this book also feel like a fever dream. At times I was left confused about what was going on, and sometimes the story was hard to follow. I feel like this was intentional and will make the book a rewarding experience on a second read through, but I can understand if some readers bounce off of it because of that. The main character, Prospero, is a very interesting wizard. He isn't your typical wizard like Gandalf, and when I dug deeper into the backstory of this book, I found out that was intentional. In Something About the Author, Volume 2, Bellairs had this to say: "The Face in the Frost was an attempt to write in the Tolkien manner. I was much taken by The Lord of the Rings and wanted to do a modest work on those lines. In reading the latter book, I was struck by the fact that Gandalf was not much of a person, just a good guy. So I gave Prospero, my wizard, most of my phobias and crotchets." Let me end the quote real quick. I didn't know crotchet was a word, but I like it. Rest of the quote now. "It was simply meant as entertainment, and any profundity will have to be read in." This gives Prospero a more realistic slant that you normally don't see with wizards in most fantasy novels written in the late 60s and early 70s. It was such a joy to read about an all-powerful magic user that still makes mistakes any regular person would make. I also really enjoyed the pacing of this novel. You can't make every page of a horror novel terrifying. or it starts to lose its effect. And Bellairs proves his mastery of that pacing in this book. He knew how to write grounded characters dealing with terrifying situations while simultaneously managing to keep things light and funny when the story demands it. None of it feels forced like it has in other horror novels I've read, where they try to add humor to lighten the mood. This book is very short by modern standards, but packs a lot of quality into its 153 pages. As I've been digging into older speculative fiction, I've been surprised at how much meat is on the bone of these skinny novels. These older, shorter books feel just as rewarding and entertaining as the current generation of fantasy, but they're normally a quarter the size. It just feels like these books have a lot more respect for your time you're spending reading. Do books like this still get written, or are we in a time of page count bloat? Let me know in the comments if there are any really good sub 200 page fantasy books that have been written in the last 5 years. Maybe we just call those novellas now, but even then they feel few and far between. I try to keep these reviews spoiler free, and honestly, spoiling any of this book by talking about the plot would be a significant chunk of the book. It's just so short. Like, what do? I spoiled 5 pages. Oh, that's a decent chunk of the book. So I'll just leave it with, this is a must read for anyone that enjoys horror or fantasy. I really think you will like it. If you get lost in some parts where you're reading, just plow through and enjoy the ride. It's worth it. This isn't much of a spoiler, but when I said earlier that John Bellairs is really good at writing nightmares, there's parts of this book where you're looking through the eyes of the main character, and both you as a reader and him as a person in the story don't know if they're awake or trapped in a dream. And I think that can be confusing a little, but just plow through the confusing parts and it'll make sense by the end. Well, that's all I got to say about it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.